So what we're hoping to do today, oh there you go. What we're hoping to do today is give you some, very practical examples of interventions for promoting social emotional competencies and positive behavior at all three levels of the MPSS model. So universal practices for all students, secondary supports for some students who need additional support, and tertiary supports for students with more intense needs. Before we jump into the specific practices though, we wanted to begin with a little bit of context of how to think about the universe of interventions and programs and how to make sure that you're developing the model that makes most sense in your community. I like to think about it as a metaphor of a puzzle, except not the kind of puzzle where you just buy a box with 500 pieces and you know that all 500 pieces are there, but nothing else. But more the kinds of puzzles that we have in my house, having 2 kids, where you have like 5 different puzzles and all the pieces are all mixed together. And so you're trying to build that one puzzle, but you don't know which pieces belong to which one. So that's kind of like how the world of programs to promote SEL and behavioral and positive behavior kind of works. There's a lot of different programs, a lot of different processes, different approaches. And what we want to talk about is how do you develop a comprehensive model through the selection of interventions in a way that creates a comprehensive approach for supporting all students, and how do all the different programs at all 3 levels kind of work together and support each other. Okay. So you've seen this, I'm guessing, maybe 500 times today and yesterday. So today obviously we're going to be talking about the 2 of the 3 buckets, behavioral interventions and social emotional interventions. But it's important to begin here because this is the picture of the puzzle we want to build. It's the whole thing together. We can't really separate social emotional program interventions from academic programs, from our academic instruction, nor can we separate programs to promote positive behavior. We really want to be thinking about how does it all fit together? How do we build one big puzzle with all the different pieces in a way that fits? And it's not just about the 3 interventions, but it's about the whole process, the approach that you use to build the model, again, in a way that is comprehensive. So just kind of a few quick contextual slides or comments. First of all, how does PBIS and the promotion of positive behaviors, how does that fit with SCL? It's something that we've been struggling a lot to figure out how do we talk about that in a way that kind of is cohesive. So this is one way to think about it. Behaviors are things that we can see. We can see how kids are behaving. We can see, our kids behaving per expectations or not. But underlying that is everything that is going on internally, right? It's how are they, what is their experience in their community, in their family, within the school? How does that impact their emotions, their thoughts, what needs do they have? So we really want to talk about all that. And one of the things that's actually missing from this slide is the academic piece. But obviously that's all part of the equation, right? So that's in terms of the content. In terms of thinking more about the process of thinking about programs, we are going to be talking about different practices, but we want to make sure that as we're all thinking about different practices, that we're thinking about all the different pieces that need to be put together in order to make sure that practices work. And that involves making sure that the selection of processes is informed by data-driven decisions. So thinking about data, I know that John did a wonderful job yesterday with a data workshop then, but we can talk more about that offline if people are interested in talking more about data. And also that we have the right systems, we have the right professional development, that we have the right leadership, that the context for the proper implementation of practices is in place as well, and obviously that everything is done in a way that is culturally sensitive and responsive to your community. But we'll be focusing on practicing. So just very quickly, part of the process of building the puzzle is what is the process you want to use? How are you going to go into the big box of tons of puzzle pieces to select the right things for you? And so that's something that we want to briefly talk about as you're thinking about the different examples of practices. And this is one model. There's actually a couple of slides showing different models. I'll just kind of go quickly through them. There's a plan to implement, evaluate, right? So you start with what is the need, what is the problem that we're trying to address, what is it that our students need. Establish specific goals for what you're trying to accomplish, develop the solutions or select the right practices that will help you develop a plan for how they'll be implemented. So what is the implementation plan? And then how to make sure that you're continuously checking in to make sure that the programs you're implementing are actually achieving the goals that you've intended, and if not, how to reevaluate and reassess. I'm going to skip this one. You've seen this one. And then when thinking about implementation, one of the important things, and one of the things I like about this slide, is that it really illustrates implementation is not a moment in time. It's not what I do today. Implementation is about the process. How do I take something from beginning to end? Beginning with exploring what is out there, what is it that I need, and how do I make sure that my students are getting the right practices, the right interventions for their specific need? How does it all work together? And then beginning with installation. How do I bring that into the school? How do I bring it into the system, kind of create the system changes required to accept a new set of programs? Begin with implementation, testing things, making sure they're working, making sure both implementation-wise and also in terms of outcomes, they're actually getting at what we're trying to do. Then moving from there to full implementation, and ultimately sustainability. If you have something that works, how do we keep it? This is just another way of thinking about it. Awareness, and obviously you guys have the slides, so you can pick the model you like better to think, what do I want to be thinking about? So this is just a different way of thinking about it. Awareness of these that exists. Thinking about what is the content I want to use, the resources available to actually address the needs. Process and supports for making sure that I can implement effectively. Value to make sure it's working. And then again, going back to, so what now? Do we need more? So I think this is where I turn to you. So this is implementation. Now we'll move into the practice.
Great. Thank you, Shai. Okay. So I need a clicker. Excellent. So my job here is to go over a bunch of set of practices across universal, secondary, and tertiary level within an hour. So I'm going to really quickly expose you to things and show you some resources and where you can get some more info about it. But I'm going to go kind of quickly, and I apologize, okay? But we're more than happy to talk about these things offline. The slides and the resources all have hyperlinks in the notes section, so please use those and find them. Oh, thank you. I'm not a great mic person. So yeah, please use those and click on those, and hopefully you'll have more resources to come back and look at things. Okay, so in the sense of universal practices, this is for all. When we talk about the triangle, that is all students. So that when we say all, that's just all the students that benefit from universal practices. That means every student in the school building, right? So students with special education needs, students with tier 3 needs, students with tier 2 needs still benefit from universal practices. If you do universal practices well, you'll have fewer students that need additional support, right? So that stuff we know, okay? So things that we're thinking about as we kind of build these things is that, as Shai talked about, it's critical to have the implementation process thought about. So as much as we're going to be talking about practices today, one thing that we need to think about is maybe think about fewer practices, but do them well, okay? How are we going to implement them? How are we going to support staff? How are we going to look at data to make sure what we're doing is working? So those all things need to be in there, okay? And as we talked about, as Dr. Novak talked about this morning, equity is an important piece of this puzzle, right? Is making sure that there's equal access to all, and also make sure everybody's benefiting. And that means sometimes other students get more, and that's really important, okay? And I think I clicked something weird, and now it's frozen. So I apologize. Thank you, whatever magic you did, awesome. So the first thing to do, you need to make sure you're doing, regardless of what tier you're looking at, and universal tier is critical, is have a school leadership team. I wouldn't recommend having a PBIS leadership team and a school climate leadership team and an SEL leadership team. If your teams have the same goals, there should be one team, okay? And that team is going to build an action plan. And is there a red light little thing? There's no red light button. Okay, no, it's working, it's working. It's working. I just didn't know if there's a red light, a little flicker. But you need to have a team. The team comes together and forms a plan. that plan should be documented and written down somewhere, right? And so you can always refer back when there's staff that need more support or you have new staff, you want to have an actual plan to go to. So make sure whatever you're doing at the universal level is written somewhere on some kind of shared drive and actually written down and is clear for staff. So, and that's part of the process, right? So as we talk and as I go into talking about specific supports for students at a universal level, context matters. How you engage in social skills in the bathroom versus arrival dismissal versus the classroom shifts differently, right? Like when I have social skills in this setting versus when I go out to the bar, I'm allowed to do much different things, okay? And so my social skills shift, right? Those of you, I grew up in a very Jewish conservative home, and what I was expected to do in my home and what I was expected to do in my school in Kansas was very different, right? So because of that, context matters, and we need to teach a little bit of the uniqueness and code switching for students as well, okay? So with this, the main practices, the structure for your practices at school-wide work is consistent. You want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So that could take, sometimes that takes 3 years just to get that, right? And that leadership team comes with a common vision and purpose, right? In addition, we want to treat SEL, mental health, like we treat academics. So when we teach an academic math skill, we make sure we have direct instruction, right? We explicitly teach that skill, we give them time to practice, and we give them feedback. With behavior, social emotional skills, mental health, we want to do the exact same piece. So we want to make it very clear and have clear expectations on what the skills are, what it looks like in those settings. We want to give opportunities to teach, and teaching SEL shouldn't only occur Mondays and Wednesdays at 8:30. SEL, mental health occurs all day long, okay? So thinking about how you're integrating that work across the school day is critical, right? So making sure we're teaching, having a clear method of encouraging and giving feedback when students do things right, like if they did a math homework, you're going to get feedback on that homework. We want to set up a system to give feedback on the behavior and social skills of the students when they're engaging and they're using them, right? To make sure it's encouraged. And then we want to have a discouraging system, a way of reducing and making sure we're not reinforcing the behavior we do not want to see, okay? And then we want to have a way of monitoring and data. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about each of these really quickly. Okay. So how many people have seen a teaching matrix? Excellent. Okay. So for those I can't see, hopefully it's very small. This is an eye test for many of you. But for what this is a system for staff more than students. It's a way of getting all your staff on the same page with how we expect of staff and students in the building. And there's a couple things that are going on here. There's clear expectations that are universal, right? That everybody uses, so we all kind of start working on the same vocabulary, right? And then we have context, because context matters. Again, how I behave in one context is going to be different. So respect for your students is going to be different in different places. Respect in the playground looks different than respect in the classroom versus what it looks like in the streets in their home. And that needs to be understood. Those differences need to be talked about in an open way, and it's okay that, it's okay that there's going to be some differences there. We need to make sure that we students are learning to code switch. Okay, so that context matters, and then specific behaviors of what we expect. We all want to make sure all the staff, all the students, we get voice from our students, and we get voice from our families and communities, so the values of the communities are built within this. Okay, and I'm going to pass it over to John to talk about some examples of how this has worked in Methuen.
So, kind of peppered throughout the presentation, there are points where I'll hop in and I'll start to talk about a specific piece of implementation. It would be absurd to say that, this is everything that that comprises our PBIS system. This is just one piece, but I think it's a piece that helps to give some context to what our recognition system looks like embedded within our larger PBIS implementation. So at the high school, this is a secondary example, we've gone with this diagram that is really kind of we felt like at that level, developmentally, they could start to understand some concepts as opposed to having the behavioral expectations matrix kind of plastered all over the walls. We are unpacking this by context in the CAF, the hallway, the auditorium. So there are some specific diagrams that are associated with context, but this is our overarching diagram. And what we've done is we have used the CASEL competencies and crosswalked those with our behavioral expectations, or we call these our community values and expectations, so that we can really reinforce that, yes, while you're at Methuen High School, you know, these are our expectations. But when you're home and when you're in the community, we also want you to exemplify what it means to have Ranger Pride. So I feel like it's worth mentioning that there was some thoughtfulness behind. We should really be integrating. We have an opportunity to do that. We can start to teach behavioral expectations and our community values, and also reinforce social emotional learning competencies. So just a little bit of a kind of tangible example for how does a student earn a Ranger Pride point? And there you go, another acronym, an RPP. So any member of the Methuen High School community can, when they see someone exemplifying one of those community values and expectations, award that student with an RPP. And the message that we send to staff is, listen, this has to be in the moment, it has to be behavior-specific praise, you have to let them know why they're getting that point, and it has to happen, again, in the moment. You can't pop a point in the system and then tell the kid a week later, or never tell them, and expect for that to reinforce the behavioral expectations that we expect. We also set up a system where we use Infinite Campus. Any users of Infinite Campus in here? No? We got a few in the back. Shout out to Infinite Campus people in the back. Our system has allowed for us to kind of code different expectations so that every single staff member in the building can draw upon that diagram, and those 12 community values and expectations are in a drop-down menu so that they can just select one of them, and it will go into the student's profile and generate an automatic email to the parent and the student that will go out every day and say, today, your son or daughter earned a Ranger Pride point for X. Thank you for reinforcing our community values and expectations. And it goes on to show them the Ranger Pride diagram and really try to rope in the parents into the process of reinforcing that behavior at home. So I think it's a nice example of trying to involve the family in our internal systems. Okay, hand it back.
John, as a parent of whom that does work.
Thank you, that's great. Excellent to hear. So, as John was saying, an important thing as we're trying to do is really teach behavioral social emotional skills as academic skills, and really helping our staff understand that when it comes to behavioral challenges or social challenges, we just don't exclude or punish. We move towards an instructive model. And part of that is setting things clear. If you have an SEL program and you're doing a PBIS framework, you can integrate that and think about what social skills are we focusing on for our students, and how do we integrate that throughout the day, and when should they use it, and what should it look like? And then we can prompt them and have the staff in those settings prompt, look for, and give feedback to those students in those settings. So we do not want SEL to occur at certain times of the day that's happening twice a week. We want social emotional learning to happen all day long. Your staff are doing it anyways, so we want to make sure it's integrated, it's explicit, and we're prompting. Okay, so same types of thoughts here. This is another example, another test for eyes. But you can see the slides in the Google Drive. Another example for technology. Okay, but it's more about integrating. And that's all I had for now. And Shai, I think you're going to talk about thinking about SEO.
So when we think about SCL, as Adam said, SCL isn't just a course, a particular class that you teach, a particular time, but it's also not a specific moment in time in the life of your student. So, we've heard schools say, yeah, we teach SCL, we have a curriculum in second grade. That's when we teach SCL. SCL social emotional competencies are very much developmentally linked to developmental stages, right? So the kinds of competencies that you need both intrapersonal and interpersonal to relate to people, to develop meaningful connections, to believe in yourself, to have a strong self-awareness. That looks differently for a second grader as it does for 11th grader. So what we want to be doing, much like academic subjects, much like you would do with math or history, you want to be thinking about how do you teach students these competencies in a developmental stage. And these SEL programs that you have in place have to kind of be linked to each other, aligned across grades. So this is a great example specifically from the New York State Department of Education, where they develop specific benchmarks. So you have a specific competency, or a specific skill, identify, manage one's emotions and behaviors, and then they figure out what is it that we specifically want to accomplish in each grade or block of grades, much like any other kind of standard, much like you would have for, again, any academic subject. And then you figure out for each one, how do we do that? How do we make sure that for each grade that we're actually teaching the kids towards those benchmarks or towards meeting those standards? And then when we think about how do we do that, it's not just about, well, what is the right curriculum? That might be part of it. But it's really thinking about how do we teach SEL, again, as Adam said, throughout the whole day? How do we integrate in everything that we do? So once you have the approach, what is the standalone program? Maybe that's one, the one approach you want to use. So we want to have specific curriculum, so then you select the right curriculum. But what are opportunities for practice and reinforcement outside of the particular program? In the classroom, in the playground, throughout the school day. How do we integrate SEL into academics, looking at those specific benchmarks? And then how do we promote them in a school-wide context? So for each benchmark, for each set of grades, how are we going to accomplish it in these 4 different approaches?
Okay, thank you, Shai. So with this, as we were talking about, as hopefully we're getting the message across about teaching and making sure that SEL and behavior and school climate is part of our instruction, we need to think about what the instructional pieces look like, how it occurs throughout the daily routines, and how we build that in for our staff. So this is why when you have a team, staff need to be on that team and talk about how their day looks, how their day works, and so it's clear that they're involved with understanding how this integrates within the work that they're doing throughout their day. It also needs to be considered that when you teach a social skill or a behavioral skill, you have to think about that context and go to that setting and teach it. You don't learn how to behave in the cafeteria by practicing it in the classroom, okay? So have your lesson plans in different locations depending on what you're teaching. Okay, so if you're teaching playground and SEL work on the playground, go to the playground. If you're teaching appropriate bathroom behavior, go to the bathroom. Okay, not go to the bathroom, but teach it in the bathroom, I should say. With all that in mind, you want to think about that context, okay, and keeping it there. The other piece that we brought up is feedback. We want to make sure, just like academic skills, and when you do an academic assignment, you're going to look at that assignment and give feedback to that student, whether they got it right or wrong, and give hopefully a lot of positive feedback. We want to make sure that you're doing that with social skills and behavior as well. Behavior that's reinforced and is more likely to occur again, right? So you look, and when you do your walkthroughs in your buildings, you should be listening for how much positive commenting is happening versus corrective comments. You want to make sure that there's 4 times more positive comments than corrective comments. This comes out of the marriage literature, went into businesses, and now it's in schools. So if you want to take that home and think about your significant other, you can do that as well. But always think about, is the school climate a positive one? Are we hearing much more acknowledging of students and of staff than we are hearing corrective? Okay, so that's one of the easiest things that you can do. John talked about his acknowledgement system and how it works with the range of pride points. It can be done in so many different ways. But really, if you're focusing on a positive school climate where you have clear expectations and you're acknowledging students for doing it, you're more likely engaging in the positives. Students see that model, the oxygen in the room is being sucked up by the positives. You're less likely to have to engage in disciplinary measures, okay? And that's really the kind of the main feedback on that. So, do you want to say anything, or
Yeah, so just kind of back to the RPPs. One thing that I think it's worth mentioning, right, you're acknowledging the student in the moment, but they're collecting those points over time, and then you're acknowledging them again later as they hit milestones on this continuum, so that we're continually reinforcing behavior. We're also giving students an opportunity to kind of look down the line at things that they could potentially get to. And it's you know, the tangible things that we offer are things that are very sustainable. We give them tickets to the home game. We give them, we have some community-based businesses that give us free chicken sandwiches at Chick-fil-A, and they like go nuts over that. But it's stuff that we ask for. We leverage our community resources, and then we do things like a breakfast. We have Ranger Pride Breakfast Club if you get to 15 points. So stuff that we know we can leverage our people in-house and our community-based organizations to feed into this continuum. It gives the students an opportunity to gun for something in the future, but it also gives them a secondary opportunity to be reinforced for those things that we really want them to do. We also, force them to take a picture, and we pop that up on the digital signage, so they love that. It's more of an opportunity to kind of show that we have a lot of students that we want to recognize, put their name out there, and give an opportunity for other students to see that, oh, well, if one of my friends can do that, then I can probably do that too.
Thank you, John. So we're really building in instructive procedures. However, at times, students will still engage in problem behaviors. So setting up your system so that we have clear responses for students is one way that we can make sure that when these things happen, it's become a much more efficient process. So thinking about having a flow chart and have clear, transparent ways for responding for staff and students is always very helpful. So if you want to see resources on this, you can see this on the slide. And at anypbs.org, our website, you can kind of go and look at day 3 team training materials, and you'll see a lot more examples of this as well, especially in our training materials are the workbook, and it's on day 3. But come up to me and I can show you more examples. One thing to think about though is that when we are considering responding to student behavior, this is where equity really comes to play. Anytime a student is sent out of the classroom, they can lose up to 25 or more minutes of instructional time. So we really need to think about how we are responding and make sure that we're responding in a way that's fair. Okay? So really, especially when it comes to this work, and even the restorative practices work, which is really about teaching and being instructive in its own way, we need to make sure that we're monitoring our data for equity. Okay? So this is where the restorative practices, restorative justice work comes in, is when you talk about how we respond to students who engage in problem behavior, right? Remember, the larger framework needs to be instructive. So you want to spend the majority of your time on how to set kids up so they do not engage in problem behavior. You want to make sure they have the social skills, they know when to do them, and the culture and the climate of the school is one that's positive and encourages it, right? However, when things do happen, we want to be instructive. And so restorative practices can help support that. Okay, so thinking about crosswalk and those features as well. Okay, so I'm going to move through Classroom really quickly, because Classroom really builds on school-wide, but it's important to think about, this is when we look at our data nationwide, Classroom is obviously the #1 location for having problem behaviors. Look at the list here. Obviously having structure, having clear routines, having high engagement instruction, and then having that feedback for acknowledging students for engaging in that work, and having some kind of monitoring system are all common practices. A great resource here is if you go to the Exploring Responding document in the slide, and this is hyperlinked, it's a nice example of how to structure your professional development around classroom supports. Okay? It has a chart of all the different components of classroom supports, And you can work with your staff on where they might need additional support. They can do a self-assessment, which is built into this. And then in addition, it goes through each of the practices and outlines them for elementary, secondary level, gives you resources. Just by the way, the PBIS.org website just got redone yesterday. So all our hyperlinks may be a little bit off. But if you have any problems, you can always email me and I can find you that resource on these types of things. All my hyperlinks are correct. I corrected it yesterday. But here's an example, and so look through this, and anything around classroom supports and supporting your teachers, this is a wonderful resource around those aspects, okay? Equity. Equity is a clear, important piece. Dr. Novak spoke about it earlier. Infusing this, braiding it within the work that you do within schools around all practices needs to be considered, okay? So I'm just gonna, this is a great resource that's hyperlinked as well, and you can download this from the website, and it has much more info, but I'm just gonna highlight the major things that are pinpointing towards what is reducing disproportionality within schools. Clear, effective instruction, having school-wide positive behavioral supports has been shown to show decreases. There's a couple things that are showing real clear outcomes, and one is disaggregating your data by ethnicity, race, and disability, and looking at it and having those conversations with your staff, showing the data and the disproportionality to your staff, and discussing why this is happening. Okay, that is the first and step one of what you can do. Okay, so if you need any help with that, let us know. Having clear procedures around accountability, that really has shown to decrease cases of explicit bias. And developing teaching neutralizing routines really supports implicit bias. So having clear accountability for staff, that will show those staff that are explicitly being biased. That hopefully will help reduce those pieces. What we found is start reducing implicit bias is those neutralizing routines when staff are sending students out of the classroom. That's when, if you're sending more kids of color outside the classroom and they're losing instruction, that's when some of those implicit biases can end up creeping in and causing us to make bad decisions, or decisions that really have severe impacts on students' learning. So with that, teaching neutralizing routines that keep kids in the classroom and supports them, and go to that resource. It talks about these vulnerable decision points and what other strategies we could use to keep students in the classroom and benefiting from your instruction. Okay, so that's one of the biggest pieces there. Non-classroom settings really quick. Things like hallway, arrival dismissal, cafeteria. It's really kind of having clear expectations, a lot of the same things, making sure the staff are present in that setting, giving feedback, pre-correcting, knowing your troublesome locations, and helping them make sure that those locations are maximized for efficiency, and feedback is given throughout. Okay, having clear staffing, so the staff isn't all standing up in front of the cafeteria talking about their past weekend. You want them moving around the cafeteria and kind of not doing what I'm doing now, and interacting with students. Family participation also needs to be integrated throughout. One of the key messages here is making sure that the communication with families is not one directional, is bi-directional. Making sure that you're getting feedback from your community and your families on the different practices that you're engaging in, and making sure that they're reflective of the norms and values of the community. Okay? So if you have an expectations matrix or you're teaching social skills, do those social skills reflect the values of the families and the community that you're in? You know, get some feedback on that. Maybe it's more reflective of a dominant culture. Okay? So have a parent group, having families come in and give that input. The other thing when it comes to universal supports is really kind of looking at making sure that you're integrated and aligning across your different kinds of pieces. Another resource around this that's linked here is this technical guide on integration and alignment. If you're trying to do a bunch of different things like mindfulness, SEL, positive supports, trauma-informed, and you have different teams all working on this, talk about integrating it. Talk about thinking about what's our common goal, what are common measures, and where do we overlap in data and practices and systems. Hopefully, we can start combining and integrating and doing less PD that's integrated and make sure that staff don't have to integrate it themselves. If we can integrate at the district level and then help school administrators integrate it at the school level, that'll help teachers integrate it at the classroom level. Okay? So professional development and SEL, trauma-informed, PBIS should all occur at the same time. Should be integrated. We need to help you all do that. Okay, different examples of this is think about where those practices overlap. This is from the state of New Jersey and how they are starting to organize their training. And responsive classroom and mindfulness isn't blank for a reason. It's blank because they let the schools fill that in districts. But they're starting to kind of overlap. Thinking about how to integrate the SEL teaching within a district and making sure it's clear to the school of how you crosswalk your SEL social skills and your PBIS expectations, and making sure that it's clear throughout for staff. So everybody's using the same language. Okay? And then when we're thinking about instruction, how do we integrate it in instruction? So here's an example again with science and math, and thinking about how do we start thinking about the work that we're doing when we're talking about science labs, and where does those SEL skills work then? And so we're already helping infuse that for them so that it's easier lift for our staff to integrate these types of competencies that we want our students to gain, and we're already starting to blend that in our instructional routines. Okay? So some of this work, I'm hoping the message is coming through that we need to start doing this in our PD, and think about for them, here's a bunch of examples, and actually comb wonderful examples from your staff. Okay, so here's an example of different resources. We talked about the classroom practices brief, the technical guide of integration and alignment I've already shown you. A couple other examples are listed here. The tiered fidelity inventory is a set of school-wide practices, tier 2 practices and tier 3 practices. That's free online and hyperlinked on the next slide. It has a companion guide for cultural responsiveness. If that is a goal, and hopefully it is for you in your district, you can look at the hyperlinked cultural responsiveness guide to think about how are we integrating when we are working with students and families, how we are integrating that work as well. Okay, so it's a snapshot of that. This is a quick snapshot of building district capacity to implement positive supports and other behavioral frameworks. And that's a resource as well. I just wanted to touch on that and move on due to the sake of time. And now I'm going to take a break, and I'm going to pass it over to Shai, who's going to talk about selecting SEL programs.
Yeah, just very quickly before we move on to secondary interventions. One of the important aspects of any kind of program is obviously selecting the right program. We know that there's a lot of great SEL programs, there's a lot of evidence-based programs, that's obviously what we want. The question is, how do you select the right program for your schools and at different grades? So what I just put in is just a couple of great resources. This is specifically from Castle. It's a guide of all evidence-based interventions. You can look at it very quickly by what is the grade that you want, but most importantly by looking at what specific, what aspects of the school or what kinds of teaching experiences does a program address? Is it teaching practice? Is it integrated into a particular academic subject? A lot of these programs are not necessarily SCL programs, but might be like as the first 2 language arts program or social studies, but that embed in them teaching on focusing on specific social emotional competencies, and obviously the settings. So this, what I like about this resource is that it forces you to think about where do you fit these programs in the school day. And then this is another great resource from the Walls Foundation. What they did with these particular programs is also telling you what specific social emotional competencies do different programs address. The resource actually provides all kinds of helpful information about the programs. I like this specific table, I like this in particular because it really gives you a sense that any particular intervention addresses multiple competencies, but not to the same extent. So if you're thinking about your data, you're thinking about assessment, you're thinking about your goals, what is it that you're trying to accomplish in your schools, you can go back to this and find what is the intervention that is really, or the program that is really getting at the competencies that are most, that are a priority for us. And it gives you kind of that nice kind of in a percentage way rather than just checks. So those are just 2 quick resources on that.
Okay, so we threw a lot of stuff at you really quickly. So we want to give you time to process that. So let's take about 5 minutes and we'll do a turn and talk. And hopefully during the 5 minutes, what we want you to do is think about, of the content that was presented, what is already occurring in your district that's just going really well? What are the pieces that really resonated with you? What are some things that you may think about, oh, we need to really consider doing this more or better, and that you might want to think about bringing back to your school or district? Okay, let's take 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, why don't we take about 30 seconds? We'll come back together as a large group. Could we have one or two people brave enough to share out really quick some of the discussions, or either things that they feel like they're doing well or things that resonated with them that they want to bring back? Anyone? A large room, you get a lot of attention. Okay, really quick. Anyone? Okay. Well, feel free, if you raise your hand, like we're happy to stop and pause on things. Okay, but for the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving and talk about secondary supports. So now we're getting into students who need more support, but don't need individualized support, okay? So to talk about student identification is one of our key things we wanted to talk about, common tier 2 features, and really kind of matching students to supports. We'll talk about I want to talk about practice elements, and I find that tier 2 is this kind of lost kind of set of strategies that are difficult to really work with because we always want to individualize beyond. And here's the idea is like we need to be standardized and manualized, and it's kind of like this is our strategy. We can tweak it a little bit for a student here or there, but in generally we're kind of giving a standardized, manualized program so it's efficient and we don't have to waste a lot of staff time putting a student on or supporting a student with a tier 2 support. And that's what makes tier 2 supports different than tier 3 supports, okay? So, but it has a lot of features of tier 1, but it antes them up, ramps them up, right? So it still has staff support, but more. We still are doing explicit skill instruction, but we're doing more of it and it's more tailored to that student's profile, right? And we're still giving feedback. We're just giving more of it, okay? So with that, we're just starting to target and make it more clear to behavioral or social profiles of students, okay? One of the major things here that I want to just really quickly say is that it's important if you're engaging in tier 2 work that you have solid tier 1 foundations to build upon. Tier 2 isn't a solution for tier 1 or classroom issues. If you have more than 5 kids in a classroom on a tier 2 support, that is a problem. That will not work, okay? You can't, these systems were not made to solve the problems of tier 1 or classroom. So please, please make sure that you're working on your tier 1 first, or majority of the time on tier 1 if you're not at fidelity at those levels. Okay, so things that need to be critical as you're looking at putting students and matching them up with tier 2 supports is that you're thinking about your data sources. You want to have multiple data sources as we're looking at, okay? So not just one data source. You want to have clear decision rules that are flexible, okay? So it's not just willy-nilly, we put kids on supports, okay? We have a decision rule and how we kind of who gets on what, who graduates, or who completes, or who goes up for more intensive supports. And that you have some kind of standardized request for assistance form so students, staff, and families can access supports, okay? And so for examples of that, John's going to talk about how that works in
So I'm going to talk about a couple data systems that we have. We screen students in grades 3 through 12 using multiple different measures for mental health. The idea behind this is that districts don't have a lot of psychosocial data, or none. And whatever data that they do have tends to be aggregated and not specific to a student, but more pointing to a general problem. I think YRBS, right, aggregate level data, this is a problem, but I don't know for whom it's a problem. So we have instituted mental health screening to be able to get to those students in a way that will link them up with interventions, group therapy program, individual therapy program, and then using those same data sets for progress monitoring. One of the kind of key pieces that I wanted to mention is that before we started mental health screening, we of course identified students that needed social, emotional, mental health services and supports, but we took some data, and after we had instituted screening, we realized that there was a 63% increase in the identification of students who required services for internalizing concerns. So that tells me, right, that We had systems before, they were working to identify students, but we were missing a huge swath of students. If we did not use screening, we wouldn't get to them, and that's a huge problem. I think as a field, we're kind of terrible at identifying students with internalizing concerns, so this is a means to kind of bridge that gap. The data is sent to we do use a web-based program to be able to administer our screening tools, and it is incredibly efficient. We have screening that takes place at a grade level, and 20 minutes later, we have our school mental health staff responding to those students and conducting clinical interviews. So one of the things that I think Adam alluded to, right, is that you need a decision rule. You need a cut score for these screening tools, and we look to the literature for that. So students that score in the moderate to severe range for depression or anxiety, they are immediately called down for a meeting with their counselor to be able to talk about and validate that data that comes from the screening. You know, there are certainly times where we have students that kind of just rip down the right side of the screening tool and then they say, oh, I didn't know you were going to look at that data. So you do have to scrub the data a bit and get to a point where you can validate whether or not it's meaningful. On the other side, behavioral data, we've established data rules that inform other teams, and I guess I'll talk about one of them, the non-ODR intervention team. So we've split our behavior into non-ODRs and ODRs, non-office discipline referrals and office discipline referrals, minors, majors. And our data rule is that 3 or more non-ODRs in a 2-week period will get you a processing and problem-solving meeting with a staff member associated with that team. Very light touch intervention, process, problem solve. This is not a discipline meeting. We work through the function of the behavior, try to get a little bit more info, and we close. That information is sent back to the referring teachers, administrators, who put that data into the system, which is a common system being used by all staff members. And it serves to not only extinguish behavior at times, but it reinforces the use of that data system, because right in the summary email that goes out to all staff members, they see that their data that they entered caused that intervention to happen. So it's a nice, dually purposed intervention. This is just a quick shot of the shared referral sheet that people receive who are associated with the team. They claim a student, they put their notes in here. It keeps us able to track that data over a long period of time. And ultimately, we have a secondary data rule associated with this team. If you meet multiple cycles of this intervention, because we run on 2-week cycles, and perhaps a student receives 3 or more non-ODRs in one cycle, and then in the next cycle they receive 3 or more non-ODRs, that intervention's not working, right? We need to move to a different intervention, so it's a feeder system for Tier 2, and perhaps that student would benefit from check-in, check-out, and we have procedures in place to check for that.
Thank you. So as John explained, with how they kind of make these decisions up in Methuen, having some kind of structure and format to how your team meetings work can make it a little bit more standardized. And the piece around Tier 2 is you need to kind of think in a more standardized way in how we're providing more support or increased levels of support, and that can always be a little bit of a challenge. So thinking about with your team, whether it's an advanced tier team or a Tier 2 team or a pre-referral team, whatever your school structures it, thinking about what are our data sources, how do we make decisions across them, what are our decision rules that we typically follow, and you may kind of bend them a little bit for certain students, which is totally okay, and then how do we monitor? Making that clear is going to be very helpful when we're providing supports and trying to make sure that students are benefiting from that. The students are benefiting from the supports, and we can kind of make sure they're benefiting, move them off, and make room for other students. Okay? There's a number of empirically supported Tier 2 supports out there. Okay? Here's just a small list of the more popular things. If you look at this slide, the hyperlinks to many of these are in the notes section, so feel free to look more about that. Unfortunately, the time we don't have the time to go into each and every one of these things, so I just wanted to expose you to them. But thinking about having a number of things that are based on the needs of your school or district. So don't use a social skill that you do, don't use a social skill you don't need is probably a good thing as well, but like, don't use a tier 2 strategy that's not helpful to you, okay? Think about what your data is telling you, what types of needs your students have, and think about how we install this system so that all staff know what to do, okay? There's a number of popular things. People are probably familiar with many of the things on here and probably use a variation number of them, which is wonderful. Check and check out is one of the most popular ones, and in addition to the social skills groups, okay? If you don't have it, I encourage you to think about having a check in and check out system. It is a very common behavioral support system, and it's one of the most popular researched tier 2 programs out there, that's in addition to the social skills programs, okay? Now I'm going to pass it over to John. We'll talk a little bit about how his school is run.
Okay, so I just mentioned this. I'm not going to go into much detail. Just suffice to say, we're able to track the number of referrals that we receive over time, really dig in deep with those students and see if there is any kind of efficacy to that intervention. So I think in year 3 of implementation, about 733 referrals were made and closed out as a function of that team operating. I explained how that kind of works, so I'm just going to jump right into group therapy. Which is a tier 2 intervention that is offered at Methuen High School, and we're pushing that down to the grammar schools as well. So I'm going to cruise through these slides, so please buckle up. We don't have a ton of time left. I just want to point out that tier 2, right, is that forgotten tier. Many times we're looking at interventions that are happening at tier 3. We jump straight to tier 3 when we're worried about a student. This is an opportunity for us to have a group-based intervention that's time-tracked. We have data associated with it, we can see the outcomes, and we can make a decision at that point whether or not individual intensive intervention is necessary. So obviously at the high school setting, or really at any school, scheduling a group is pretty difficult. We do work around these things, and we get creative because it's important. We have to. Our students need these interventions to be able to find success in school. We have to really have the mantra that if these students don't receive the services and supports that they need, they're not going to make the academic gains that we want for them. And I think that has allowed for us to get creative in scheduling these groups, and also rope in teachers to understanding the importance of allowing students to access these interventions. So, quick implementation overview. We use our screening window to be able to populate our referrals for a group. And I think that's one of the massive barriers to any kind of group-based intervention, is that nailing down a core number of, or I guess a group of students at any one time tends to be a challenge. But tying our group referral window to our screening window allows for us to have a ready-made list of students that may qualify as good candidates for that intervention. We have some secondary questions that we ask them after the screening's conducted. Things like, are you comfortable sharing your information with other students? Can you maintain confidentiality? Can you commit to the group? Because it's really important that you're there. That group dynamic is incredibly effective in helping students to navigate those changes in their cognition. And then we move into obtaining informed consent and implementation and gathering outcome data. Again, cut scores associated with the measures that we use. We're looking at students who score in the moderate to severe range for depression or anxiety. We also have mixed internalizing groups that are more specialized and that talk about the interplay between depression and anxiety and navigating that form of cognitive restructuring, which tends to be a cycle that reinforces itself. Cruising through, you have all these slides. At the end, we absolutely want to report out on the degree to which there's efficacy for these interventions. Progress monitoring is a massive piece of the puzzle when it comes to therapeutic intervention, but it just doesn't happen across the field. It doesn't happen in schools, doesn't happen outside of schools. When we look at national statistics related to progress monitoring or measurement-based care, we're looking at about 1 in 5 that actually institute that practice. That's a little bit scary. You know, you wouldn't go to the doctor and have them not take your blood pressure or, check your temperature. Like, these are things that we need to do to see if our interventions have an impact. Feedback. Okay, we're going to move on.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we talked about universal practices, we talked about secondary practices, gave you some examples of such. Now we're going to talk about tertiary practices. Within these supports, this is where it's tough to talk about what the exact practices are. It's much more of having resources available and having the competence in your district to kind of respond. And honestly, what I find is having the other systems in place and effective so you have fewer students that need this level of service. Okay? And I find that the challenge when I go around the schools, it's less that they have a hard time doing this, it's just they don't have a lot of time and resources to do that because they're being sucked up with the whole myriad of challenges that schools and districts have to deal with lately. So within that, I'm not going to probably show you anything that's really super novel, but let's just kind of remind ourselves of what the different features are and how they work. As always, you want to have different teams within your school and district to help support those students that need the most needs, right? You want to have student teams that are there to create those plans and meet the needs of those students, okay? And those teams should be small and tailored to that student's particular challenges and strengths, right? You want to have a general school team that's overseeing all the different Tier 3 plans that is different than that student team, that is making sure that the people that are involved in that student team have the competence to develop those plans, and we're monitoring to make sure staff get the support they need to implement those plans, okay? And that should be have an administrator on that team to think about, does our staff who have to engage in these tier 3 plans actually have the time and resources to actually do so, okay? And then at the district, you want a district advanced tier team. This could be a Tier 2, Tier 3 team, to be honest, and most likely. And they're overseeing all the Tier 3 and Tier 2 plans across the district. And they're just have a bird's eye view about, and generally, are we effective for the majority of students? What are the common needs of our Tier 3 students that are coming up, the students that need tier 3 supports, I should say? And are we allocating resources accordingly so our staff have capacity to address our needs? Okay? So having a district team that's overseeing all the advanced tier work, having school level teams that are overseeing all the different plans that the students have, and student level teams that are implementing and supporting those students, right? So the functions will differ. The functions will differ across these different teams, right? So when you think about it, and if you kind of look at this that are on the slide, the school team is really engaged in assessment, in a diagnostic and monitoring capacity, right? And they're identifying what those needs are and providing those supports and monitoring them, right? The school level, they're really more engaging in some screening work, supporting staff and professional development, and also monitoring across all the different plans to make sure that they're effective, right? And at the district level, they're really looking at school level capacity to make sure that the schools have what they need to engage in the different types of Tier 3 needs that are there, okay? So having that district level advanced team is critical. The practice, the assessment pieces is not obviously very novel. This is stuff that you probably are engaged in, but making sure when you look over this list, there's not anything that you're missing when you're supporting your students, and especially when it comes to the family and community supports and making sure you're partnering with your families and the community, right? And then when you kind of develop a student support plan at the Tier 3 level, you want to make sure that it includes or considers each of these elements, okay? And when I've gone into schools and part of doing one of the tiered fidelity inventory pieces, you actually look at support plans. I'll at times notice some plans are missing different pieces, especially around student safety, our student pro-social skills, social skills, and making sure it's not all about reducing behavior, it's mostly about increasing social and pro-social behavior in students. What is that skill that a student's going to need to be successful over the long term? Okay, so look at that, and then consider how and well you partner with wraparound and partner with your neighboring community agencies. 2 resources here. One is the National Wraparound Center has a wealth of resources. I want to point you to them. So that's linked there. And then in addition, there's another one on the other slide. The National Wraparound Center is another one that's hyperlinked as well. You can click on either of those and they'll hyperlink you to their websites, okay? Because wraparound is key as we're doing this work. And those of you in high schools, we are very close to UNH, and UNH has a wonderful program called Renew, which is around person-centered planning at the Tier 3 level for students that that are at risk for dropping out, are at risk for having a lot of challenges and not being able to be having success at the high school level. So Renew is a great program. It's hyperlinked there, and because it's a local resource, I thought I would point to it. And I'm going to pass it over to John to kind of show you how it works.
Okay, so again, features and examples at Tier 3, and I guess this would be an example of kind of how I conceptualize treatment planning for a student receiving individual therapy, right? You're identifying the presenting problem, you're gathering some baseline data, you're implementing an EVP, and then you move into a cycle of progress monitoring and adjustment to practice. Once you get to a point where you feel as though that adjustment to practice and that data that you're tracking is at a point where you have a fit and you can move toward termination, you should. But we don't talk about termination in schools almost categorically. Once you get an intervention, it's kind of forever. So being sensitive to the data and being able to get to a point where you can say, you can go it alone. You have done the thing, we're going to monitor you, but I guess I'll give the example of emotional regulation, right? If that's the goal, then we want to see symptom presentation decrease over time while we fade the service, so that we can get to a point where we can say with confidence that this student can go it alone. We have gotten to a point where they have the skills and the knowledge necessary to be able to effectively cope. 5 minutes. In terms of intervention and treatment planning, about 5% of the student population in Methuen has an associated treatment plan with progress monitoring embedded. I feel like that's incredibly important. If we're going to do the work and we're going to do it with fidelity, then we need to track the data associated with that. Long gone are the days where we can be like, I think Johnny's doing better, and that can suffice for data. We need to be much more thoughtful in terms of planning for data collection associated with the individual interventions that we provide. This is just a ridiculous example of an intervention plan treatment tool. It's a spreadsheet, but let's be honest, if we don't write down the things that we are doing, then we can't really track data over time. Another example that I think is really important to mention in terms of the services that we provide in Methuen, we do have a bridge program associated with the BRIGHT model. So this is supporting students returning from long-term absence for hospitalization, typically psychiatric hospitalization. And the components associated with this program really revolve around academic coordination, clinical care, family engagement, and care coordination. So we are ensuring that this student has wraparound services embedded within the school and linked up with community-based agencies. It is a very heavy intervention, but it's meant to be short-term, to get a student back to school, transition them back with support. I've heard horror stories of students coming back to school after a psychiatric hospitalization, no re-entry meeting, just kind of pop back into their schedule, and then we're like, well, why did they fail? Why didn't they make it back successfully? Because we didn't provide the supports necessary. We have 2 categories of students associated with Bridge. Category H, so students who have been hospitalized and they're returning to school. And then category N, we have judged that there is a need, and perhaps we can be preventative in keeping the student from actually being hospitalized. All of these programs, right, we're talking about cognitive behavioral therapy or DBT. I think that just being sensitive to the fact that evidence-based therapeutic care is what we're talking about. We're not doing check-ins, we're not doing kind of counseling light, we're talking about evidence-based therapy. And that's what we need to be talking about when it comes to Tier 3 services in sports and the group therapy program. Last topic I'm going to run through is just our partnerships with community-based mental health agencies to foster wraparound. We have some MOUs that we've developed with community-based agencies. What I tell all of our school mental health staff is this is to augment what you do with students, not to replace you. You know, the refer and hope model does not work. We need to be working with community-based agencies to be able to provide true comprehensive services. We've seen a huge increase in service utilization over time, and these MOUs have allowed for us to have a 13% increase in available mental health staff overnight for free. We give them time, space, and referrals. They give us evidence-based practice. They coordinate with us. They give us data. So it's a mutually beneficial partnership. The amount of time for the wait list that all of you experience, 6 to 9 month wait lists, we reduced to a week because we started to partner with community-based agencies. I am going to end it there. And I think we have maybe a minute or two for questions. Yeah.
I think if it's okay, we're just going to end it here, but we'll be up here for questions for those that need it, and just want to say thank you on behalf of Shai and John and I for putting up with us for this hour and a half, or hour and 20 minutes. Thank you, thank you.